Welcome back, everyone, to our study in the big picture of the Bible, and we're at the final step in scene one. Scene one goes from Abraham to David, and we're going to begin studying David today. David is the great king that brings the whole nation together to be a great nation. Come and hear about it. I'm so excited that when Samuel came to Saul, and Saul had sinned and committed a great sin, and God told him that he was tearing the kingdom away from him, that God was going to raise up someone who would be the picture for us of what is a great king. And what set David apart from all other people was that he had a heart for God. And I want to begin to look at that with you, and hopefully this study will encourage you in your own faith. And so let me start with this wonderful idea. God always wanted to have a king, and we talked about that in one whole lesson. God always wanted to have a king, and he was going to raise up one individual, David, that would be a picture for us later, that when Jesus came, Jesus would be the son of David, the son of Abraham. And David becomes the important person for a lot of different reasons. We're going to begin exploring those reasons, but what I want you to focus on today is David's attitude. What kind of man was David? And so we're going to only look at two chapters of the Bible, 1 Samuel 16 and 17. So I'm going to read some of the verses to you, and as I read them, be thinking in your heart, what is different about what's going on here, and what's different about David? So in 1 Samuel 16, it says this in verse 1, "Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go, and I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself among his sons." So let's think about this. Here's this guy named Jesse, and his name came up in the book of Ruth. So God was already anticipating what he's going to do in history and who was going to be in the line of Christ. And so out of Ruth, we came these people. Ooh, Jesse. Now Jesse's going to have a son. And he did. He had 8 sons. And so when Samuel comes to that family, he's going to meet the sons. And you're going to pay attention to what people were looking at. What was Samuel looking at? And what was wrong with that? And so let's look at verse 6 and 7. So Jesse brings his sons there, and this is what happens. Verse 6, "When they entered, he looked at Eliab and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as a man sees. For a man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." And so you see what happened here is Samuel was falling into a little trap, just like all of his countrymen did when they saw Saul. Saul went before him. He was big, strapping, good looking, and everybody was like, yes, this is our guy. Long live the king. But he was a coward. What was going on in his heart? Did he really demonstrate the kind of character that you wanted to have in a king? And God is very clear about this. He's looking at a man, not at the outward appearance, but he's seeing the substance of a man. The substance of a man or a woman is what is in their heart. What is their moral character, their spiritual character? That's what God is looking at. And so he goes on to tell us in verse 12 and 13. He said, so all the sons, 7 sons came before him, and God rejected all of them. And then Samuel's like, don't you have any more sons? Come on. And he goes, yeah, we do. We have one, the youngest son. So they sent for him. So verse 12 says, they sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with beautiful eyes, and a handsome appearance. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose and went to Ramah. Look at what happened here. So David comes out. What is he doing? He's a shepherd. And as a shepherd, he was out shepherding the sheep. His brothers were older. You know what it's like to be the younger brother? I was a younger brother. And sometimes the older brother looked down on the younger brother. And this is what happened in this case. They all looked down. He's the youngest. So, yeah, you get the jobs nobody else wants. And so he's out shepherding the sheep. But David didn't waste his time when he was shepherding the sheep. And you're going to learn that he was learning some tremendous things. And so now God chose David and anointed him. We got a problem. Here's a big problem. The problem is you can't have two heads in one household. You can't have two heads in one kingdom. You can't have a mom and a dad be the head. Think about what's going to happen with a child if you have two heads in the same household. They go to mom, she says this. They go to dad, he says this. It's totally opposite. And so what is the child going to do? He's going to play mom against dad. He's going to be really messed up. No, you have to have one head, two working as one. Now, in this case, Saul was still king, and he was going to be king for 15 more years. Think about this. So what was God going to do with David? He just anointed him as king, but he wouldn't put him as king. Not yet. He had to wait. So God was going to train him. And David had two major tests. And so I'm going to talk about the first test today in this study. In the next study, we'll talk about the second test, briefly about it, and it'll launch us into David becoming the king for good. And so when he went up to Hebron, and God brought him up and made him king. This is a 15-year adventure of training. And what was the first training that he had to have? Well, it was the fight with Goliath. This is an exciting thing. We're going to watch how David was different than Saul and how he was different than all of the other men. So let's look at it and go to 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 4 through 7. So all of the Philistines gathered to fight Israel. And so both armies were standing out there looking at each other. And out comes from the Philistine army the big old Goliath, a Nephilim. Do you remember in our study of Joshua that they did not kill the Nephilim down in Gath, 3 different cities? And that's where Goliath is from. So this is what it says in verse 4. Then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines named Goliath, from Gath. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was clothed with scale armor, which weighed 5,000 shekels of bronze. He also had a bronze greave on his legs and a bronze javelin slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and the head of the spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. Now that's a very important point. I want to make this point to you. I'm going to make it a little bit later. In terms of military tactics, at this point, Goliath is making a huge mistake. If you have a shield bearer, that shield bearer needs to either be right next to you or standing right behind you. Why? Well, if you're right-handed and you're going to pick up your sword with your right hand, you want your shield on your left hand. So you need to quickly be able to turn and your shield bearer put the shield on your arm so that you could lift it up and be ready to fight. If the shield bearer is out in front of you, he can't put the shield on your arm. So he was out of position. This is an act of arrogance. As Goliath walks out, a shield bearer is walking out there arrogantly. You can't beat my man. Oh, okay. So this is going to play very important into our story. Let's go on to verse 23. Verses 8 and 9 and 23. Verse 8 and 9 says this. He stood and he shouted to the ranks of Israel and said to them, "Why do you come out to draw up in battle array? Am I not the Philistine and your servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will become your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall become our servants and serve us. And so Goliath made a big challenge. Here's the challenge. We won't have the whole armies fight. Just two of us fight. Me against you. Me against one of your guys. And whoever wins, then the other army becomes a slave. Okay, you guys good with that? So this is what Goliath was saying, okay? Wow, this was a problem because the people were like scared. All of the Jews were scared. Israel was scared. They wouldn't send out anybody to fight. Verse 23 goes on to say this. Verse 23, as he was talking with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine from Gath, named Goliath, was coming up from the army of the Philistines, and he spoke these same words. David heard them. So here's what happened. Goliath came out, said all these things, then he went back. Then David comes. Then he comes out again and says all these things, and David's standing there listening to this. And David's like, what in the world is going on? David was, he was home with his dad. His dad said, take some food out to your brothers. He gets out there and he sees this giant come out and say all these evil things. And David, he acts totally different than everybody else. He's different than all of them. And let's just see how different that he was. Now I want to make 4 different points about how David was different than everybody else there. And if you can think back with me, there were 12 spies in Numbers chapter 13 that were sent into the promised land, and 10 came out, and they were cowards. They did not want to go fight. Well, I look at Saul and his attitude, and the rest of all the people, they were afraid of the giant, and they did not want to go fight. But David was very different. Watch what happens here in verse 26. Verse 26, David spoke to the men who are standing by him, saying, what will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should taunt the armies of the living God? So here's the first point I want to teach you about David. His attitude was totally different than everybody else. His attitude was this. This guy is taunting the armies of the God of Israel. What are you doing? Guys, what are we doing here? We can't let this happen. What are you going to do for me? I'll go stop them. What are you going to do? And so look, David's attitude was, I'm going in there. I'm going to take this guy out. Wow, nobody else would do that. Why? Because they all operated fear. David operated in courage because of his God. That's the important point to remember about David. And then he said, and jump down with me to verse 32. Verse 32 says, David said to Saul, because Saul couldn't believe this little guy wanted to go fight him. He says, let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistines. Saul said to David, you are not able to go against the Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock. I went out after him, and I attacked him and rescued it from the mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck and killed him. Your servant has killed both lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God. And so David was very different. And so here we have first his attitude. His attitude was, God will give me the victory. He gave me the victory over the bear and the lion. He'll give me the victory over these people. Second, his weapon. David had a weapon that he trained with. Now think about it. When he's a kid, he's out there and he's watching his sheep, and he took this slingshot and he's practicing for hours, throwing those rocks against something to hit it. He was getting good at his weapon. He trusted in his weapon. Goliath had a weapon and David had a weapon. But here's the difference in the two, okay? David did not trust in his weapon. David trusted in the Lord his God. Goliath only trusted in his weapons. And so that was going to be the difference. And so when they went out on the battlefield tactics, this is battlefield tactics. David knew that he was going to beat Goliath. He said, I'm going to take this guy out. He knew it because he knew God would give him a victory. So listen, Christian, you have to be looking for, when you're looking over the battlefield, look at where God gives you the advantage and where you need to attack. And that's exactly what David did. David in verse 40 and 41, this is what happened. He took his stick in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook. He put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had even in his pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Now think about this, guys. As he's approaching the Philistine, I want you to pay attention to what happens in verse 43. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. And so David was approaching this man with a totally different attitude. So look, battlefield tactics, okay? First, his attitude was, God's going to give me the victory. Second, he had a weapon, but he didn't trust in the weapon. Third, he's watching the field. What is he looking for? He's looking for an advantage so he can get the win, all right? Fourth, he's got to execute the plan. Watch what happens and comes together in verse 46 and 47. This day the Lord will deliver you up into my hands. I will strike you down and remove your head from you. I will give the dead bodies of your army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. And so this is what happened. As Goliath walked out, it says a second time in the text that his armor bearer was out in front of him. So David ran. It said he grabbed his and he ran. Why was he running? He's running towards the Philistine, Goliath. He's running so he could cut the distance between Goliath and his armor bearer, so he can't get his shield. And as he's running, he puts a rock in his slingshot, hits him right in the head, and he kills him. Now listen to me, folks. When David does that, he demonstrates for us what a true king really does. A true king trusts in God, trusts that his equipment is only as good as what God uses through him. And then third, he's looking for his battlefield. He's looking at the battlefield and looking, what is God giving me as an advantage? This is what the Lord says about you. We are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. You have good works to walk in, but you need to be like David, looking for your opportunities. David looked at the battlefield and he said, I got an advantage right here. And he took it. He believed he would win. He executed the plan for the win. Why? Because he had faith in the living God. That's the kind of leader you want. Saul never acted like that. Saul was a coward. Saul wouldn't kill the people. He wouldn't fight. He made excuses, and he rebelled against the Lord. Saul's the king you don't want. David is the king you do want. Why? Because his heart was for the Lord. He was a man after God's own heart. I want you to be a person after God's own heart. We're going to examine that in our next lesson. What does it mean to be a man after God's own heart? Please, if you like this, click and subscribe and share. Thank you very much.